Hi again and welcome to the program. I'm your host, John Loesing. California's first experiment with the so-called top two primary and the new legislative districts that were put into place occurred in the June 5th primary, and a wide range of implications not only for voters statewide but for those here in Calabasas. And here today to talk about the primary results and what to look forward to in the November general election are my two guests today, Calabasas City Council members James Bozajian and Fred Gaines. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good to see you, John.
Thank you.
James, let's start with you. Your interpretation of how this primary is different than those in the past.
This is the first time in California where you've had an open primary, as you mentioned, where everybody gets to vote with all the candidates lined up, and you can vote Republican, Democrat, Independent, and the top two vote getters. Even if somebody gets over 50%, the top two vote getters in these partisan races go to the runoff general election in November. Combined with a redistricting that was done by an independent commission and not done by politicians, and were drawn fairly randomly. Not always necessarily fairly or compactly, but randomly.
As we see locally, the Conejo-Las Virgenes area with now 3 separate new assembly districts. Well, Fred, in some cases, we wound up with a Democrat going against Democrat in November, a Republican going against a Democrat in November. In some cases, an independent came through. So did we see this nonpartisan groundswell that we were trying to achieve and this non-bickering approach? Did that play out?
Well, we're going to find out a lot more about that in November. The number one thought process in this new system was that in districts that were so overwhelmingly Democrat or Republican that you would often get 2 Democrats to a general, but the more moderate Democrat or 2 Republicans and the more moderate Republican would have a chance to win because they'd be turning around and trying to get votes from the other party, from independents. So we're going to see whether that works in November in the districts where we have overwhelming party registration in one direction, and we're going to see if how that works out. It's a little hard to tell from the primary whether that's the case or not.
Well, let's begin by taking a look at some voter registration statistics and kind of see where the allegiances lie. And once again, as we can see, Calabasas pretty much mirroring the state in terms of mostly Democratic registration as opposed to Republican, right?
Well, there's 2 trends you can see over the last 20 or so years. And the first trend is a movement away from Republican registration. The second trend is a movement toward independent or declined to state registration, which has really picked up and is now about a quarter of the voters. So those 2 trends have changed both California and Calabasas significantly. I would note that in looking over these statistics over time, the last year or 2 you've seen a slight uptick in Republican registration locally in the Conejo Valley cities. Back not to the historic levels they once were, but slightly upwards.
Well, let's turn to voter turnout. Not as much as we'd like to see. We always want to see as many people as possible take part in the democratic process, but there are reasons for that, right, Fred?
Well, this to me is the number one big story in the election. I mean, you have a presidential primary election in the largest state of the union, and it's about a 20% turnout. It's a pathetic turnout. Not completely unexpected. You have no race on the Democratic presidential side. You have no race on the Republican presidential side. You basically have no race for the U.S. Senate. You didn't have any interesting ballot propositions. These local races that were very hotly contested because of the open primary just don't draw people to the polls. And this whole idea that the moderate middle voter, independent voter can help sway these elections, that's not going to happen if only 20% of the people are turning out. Because who's turning out? Your hardcore Democrats, your hardcore Republicans, that's your 20% turnout. So unless we see an uptick in turnout in November, you're not going to see a big change in terms of trying to elect more moderate, more willing to compromise legislators. You're going to get your same hardcore activists on each side. You have to get up to 40, 50, 60% turnout to really see that kind of a change.
Yeah, but by November it's too late, isn't it, James? Because the primary is where we want to see that affected. We want to see the big turnout to get that independent say. It didn't happen, though.
That's right. A lot of more moderate candidates or independent candidates did not make it onto the general election ballot. The independent turnout and decline to state turnout was very low in this election, and the Republican turnout was higher than the Democrat turnout.
Well, let's take a look at some individual races, beginning with the 33rd Congressional District. And this is Agoura Hills, Calabasas on down the coast into the South Bay. And Henry Waxman, a solid Democrat, will be advancing on, as expected, against an independent. This is one of the few cases where the independent did come through.
The only one, John.
The only
one in the state that I'm aware of the 53 congressional districts where an independent actually made the runoff. There was a weak Republican, weak meaning weak electorally, and Waxman is the presumptive favorite. So in this particular race, unlike one we're going to discuss a little later on, it really probably isn't going to matter.
So Bill Bloomfield, the independent, will go up against Waxman. Surprisingly, in Calabasas, Fred, this Republican, Chris David, actually beat Bloomfield for the second spot on the November ticket. Maybe that Republican influence that James was talking about earlier coming through there.
Well, party preference is still a very important factor, and like I said, when you have low turnout, the people that are coming out are your more partisan, activist type voters. It is, we do have the only independent in a runoff in the state of California. It's going to be very hard for an independent to come back against a sitting congressperson. And really coalesce and get all of those Republican votes and enough Democratic votes to do it. But it'll be interesting to see if they can make any headway in that regard.
It's worth noting, by the way, this is one of the most poorly drawn districts in California. If you're looking at it objectively speaking, it goes from near the Orange County line all the way to Ventura County, in that line, and it includes communities that have very little at interest. It looks like one of the old gerrymandered districts. It's even more gerrymandered, so to speak, than the previous district that we had.
Well, another new district is the 26th Congressional District, and representing much of the former Elton Gallagher territory in Ventura County, except for bits of Simi Valley and Westlake Village. But we want to talk about it here on the Calabasas channel because it was a very interesting race. Tony Strickland fending off Linda Parks and Julia Brownley. This is a Republican-Democratic Super Bowl matchup that we were kind of hoping for, but Parks was not effective.
Well, this is our current Assemblywoman, Julia Brownley, moving over outside of the area that she represented to be the Democratic challenger to Strickland, a district that could be a toss-up. This is going to be a very interesting race in November because there's going to be a lot of money, national money, poured into this race. This is considered an opportunity to pick up a seat by the Democrats. This was Elton Gallagher's seat. The Republicans think that they can hold the seat. The primary was interesting because you had what we thought would be a very strong independent candidate, Linda Parks, very popular county supervisor in Ventura. And what this shows is just how difficult it is for an independent to break through in these races. She's an outstanding independent candidate. She's a sitting county supervisor, had been a Republican, very popular on environmental issues with some liberal groups, should be able to make inroads into the Democratic voters. But people go to the polls for Congress, and getting out of voting Democrat or Republican is very, very difficult. It shows how hard it is to raise money. She could not compete with either of the parties in terms of money raised. She got well outspent, wasn't able to respond to attacks against her, and wasn't really able to break out of that 19-20%, which is almost exactly your independent registration.
Yeah, and James, being an independent is a good thing in this new anti-bickering age that we're supposedly in, but Parks, nobody could nail her down on where she would caucus in Washington. Was she going to be a Republican? Would she sit with the Democrats? She had been a Republican, and now she's declined to state. Maybe some of that wishy-washiness hurt her?
You know what I think hurt her is this race attracted national attention. It was a 50-50 district, and if there was no Democrat in the runoff, then there was a serious threat of that, the Democrats would be shut out of this seat. And they'd spent almost $1 million really kind of trashing Parks. The Republican bankrolled about $1 million himself, and she didn't raise very much money. I agree pretty much with everything Fred said. It just goes to show that when an independent does run a credible campaign and is a credible threat to one of the two parties respond by shutting out the independent. And I am a little surprised. I kind of had a hunch she might make the runoff. I certainly thought it would be closer, considering the fact she's represented the area for so long on the Thousand Oaks City Council and on the Ventura County Board of Supervisors, but it wasn't very close.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about this 30th district, because even though it doesn't include Calabasas, it's San Fernando Valley, the Sherman-Berman show. Brad Sherman, Howard Berman, two Democrats going forward. A lot of money spent already in the primary. Millions more will be spent. This will be a dogfight all the way until November, won't it be?
Absolutely. Although Sherman did well. I mean, a 10-point advantage in the primary. This is one of those races where two Democrats, fairly progressive Democrats, long-term hardcore Democrats, now have to turn to Republican and independent voters to get elected. This is exactly the kind of race that the open primary was intended to do. Now, in this case, you have two incumbents, so whoever gets elected, you sort of know what you're getting. Mm-hmm. But they're going to have to portray themselves as more moderate, more reasonable, more willing to compromise to get through this election. And this is a $10 million race. There's going to be $5 million plus on each side. It's going to be very, very interesting to see how that turns out. But the other thing this shows, Brad Sherman was in the district. This is a guy who flew home every weekend, gave out a plaque and award to like every voter in this district. And he's 10% ahead of Howard Berman, a wonderful, outstanding congressman, but someone who did not pay attention to the district over many, many years. And that I think accounts for this percentage change.
Sherman represented a larger portion of the district previously. He also had competitive races over the years. Berman had, I think his initial race might have been competitive, but I don't think he's had a real scare since then. And I think it's also generational as well. Sherman's commercials and his advertising really portrayed himself as the new generation coming into politics, and Berman not. There is an age difference there. This was a district where both candidates, even in the primary, made blatant appeals to Republicans. Subtle, but blatant, and within Republican circles. And the quarter of the vote that was cast for Republicans, there were more Republicans voting. A lot of Republicans didn't even vote for the Republican candidate. They took sides among the two who were going to be in the runoff.
Let's move on to the 27th district. This is the 27th Senate district. Interesting district here, Zink Pavley. This was the race that Tony Strickland was going to run in originally before he had a shot at Congress. And in a surprise here, Zink prevails slightly over Fran Pavley.
Well, this is a 50-50 district now. It includes a lot of territory that is unfamiliar with Fran Pavley. Her base is in the Conejo Valley area, where she's represented in one capacity and another the citizens here for about 30 years. And there was a high Republican turnout. This is a tough district. It's a swing district. It's one that will decide whether the Democrats have 2/3 control of the state Senate or not. And Zink, who's relatively unknown, it's his first foray into politics, he beat her in the district. He won heavily in areas like Santa Clarita and Simi Valley, areas that are more Republican. He did not carry Calabasas, not a surprise given the politics and the familiarity of the voters with Pavley. But this is the only district that I'm aware of in California where an incumbent went head-to-head with a challenger, where the challenger finished ahead of the incumbent in a one-on-one race.
And also one of the races where it really didn't matter what happened in the primary. It's for statistical purposes only, because the same two are going to meet again in November.
It matters a little bit in this respect. The two parties do watch these races. The money may start flowing to Zink, which he didn't have before, and to Pavley, to help defend the seats. So we are likely to see a huge influx of money into this district, being one of the more competitive ones in the state now.
This is going to be our close, hard-fought race in Calabasas. Calabasas voters are going to be deluged by both parties, because this is a chance for the Republicans to pick up potentially a state Senate seat. They don't have a lot of opportunities throughout the state. Money's going to flow in. Pavley is going to fight very hard to keep this seat, and that's our one local race that's going to be close and hard fought. We're going to see a lot of mail, a lot of phone calls. It's going to be very interesting to watch.
And the Calabasas Assembly District, where Calabasas physically lies, is now this 45th district, won by Blumenfeld. and he'll go up against the Republican Chris Kolsky. Anything stand out on this one, James? Calabasas actually liked Bloomfield less than the rest of the district.
Well, that's because the rest of the district goes east and a little bit north into the San Fernando Valley, and we're a more Republican part of this particular district, so it's a little more evened out. However, Bloomfield is the incumbent in a district that is pretty heavily Democrat, and I would be surprised if Bloomfield didn't win by a significant margin, about a 60-40 margin in the general.
Fred, a quick comment from you before we go to break. Here's an example. I mentioned that this is the Calabasas Assembly District, but we now have, because of redistricting 3 assembly districts from Westlake Village to Calabasas. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, you know, it really matters who our elected official is. I mean, the assembly district puts Calabasas in with the west part of the San Fernando Valley. It's not completely illogical to have Calabasas with Woodland Hills and Tarzana and Encino, that 101 corridor, but it is unfortunate that we're not connected to Agoura and some of the Santa Monica Mountains areas. You know, this district goes east, the state senate district goes north, the congressional district goes south, so we are gerrymandered into a lot of different areas. The reality is, who ends up representing us is what's most important.
And James, your comments on the LA County District Attorney race. A shocker there, Turtanich not making it to the main election. What happened in this race?
Well, I'm not sure anyone's ever going to know. This, in following politics as I have my whole adult life, I was trying to think of another race where I was more surprised at the outcome, and I couldn't come up with one. Everyone expected Turtanich to finish in first place. And some people thought he'd get over 50%. I personally didn't, but a lot of people thought that. And for him to have gotten 22% in the county and finished in 3rd place after he had all the name recognition, all the background and experience, all the money, it was a true upset, and one which probably ends his political career.
TRU, true?
Yeah.
Well, let's hear for diversity, though, because Jackie Lacey could become the first black female district attorney in the county ever, and we'll know in November. But first, some unfinished business to talk about the propositions that were on the ballot on June 5th, beginning with Prop 28, term limits adjustment. James, can you define the measure here?
Sure. Prior to the passage of this proposition, you could serve a total of 6 years in the state assembly, that would be 3 terms, and then 2 terms in the state senate, that would be 8 years, for a total of 14 years, but it was strictly defined. This proposition did 2 things. It lowered the total amount of time you could serve from 14 years to 12 years, but it eliminated the stricter requirements of where you could serve it. So you could serve it all in one house if you wish to, or any combination.
Are you surprised that it passed easily?
No, I actually think it's a logical bill. One of the problems with the term limits, I mean, you're 6 years in the state assembly. You know, people were becoming committee chairs on the first day they were there, never having been to a meeting. If their Senate seat opened up after 1 term or 2 term, they were serving 1 term in the assembly and then jumping to run for the Senate. This, if you want to have a career, or 12 years, not a career, but a 12-year, you can do it in the assembly, become an expert, work on committees, follow legislation through over a period of time. So I think it's a logical adjustment.
That's a good thing. You can stay that long in one chamber, but yet cumulatively, as a total, you are going to be out in fewer years.
Correct.
2 fewer years. Let's talk about Prop 29, the tobacco tax. Tooth and nail down to the wire, and presumption is that it will prevail when all the votes are counted. Not surprising, Calabasas, one of the first cities in the nation to oppose smoking in public places, actually favored this measure, which was the additional cigarette tax. What's your analysis on this, James? Are you surprised that it lost?
A little bit. A couple things to remember. The turnout, 3 things. The turnout was a little more heavily conservative and anti-tax in general. Secondly, the no on Proposition 29 really mobilized and spent a lot of money. The tobacco companies and some of the business interests heavily outspent whatever there was as far as a campaign in favor of this. And third, to the extent the voters actually read the proposition text, it was a significant tax. it was a tax on all tobacco products, and it was, for example, it was $1 on each pack of cigarettes. That's not an insubstantial amount of money, and I think all of those combined to provide for a narrow defeat. I think if maybe the proposition were worded a little differently, it was put on a different ballot, maybe there was a little more money spent in favor of it, it probably would have passed. They're still counting ballots, but it looks like it's going to go down by about 1%.
Well, let's be real, though. I mean, a tax is a tax. However, it was a tax on smokers. California cigarette tax is not all that big nationwide. And at the end of the day, it was really about tobacco companies protecting their profits. Did they really give a hoot about this additional tax, the way they attacked it, Fred, do you think?
No, this measure lost because the tobacco companies were able to spend $50 million. They were on TV early. They shaped the issue. They shaped the the perception of what this was. And the pro people did get on TV late with Lance Armstrong and others. But the reason this loses by 1% is because of that $50 million of advertising. If you're anywhere close to even on the advertising, this measure wins by several percentage points. And Calabasas showed that there is an anti-smoking feeling here. We had a higher percentage of yes than any of our surrounding jurisdictions or the county of LA in general. And I think people in Calabasas have not only wanted to have tough anti-smoking laws, but now that we have them, have found them to be acceptable and accepted them as something that they want to do. So I think that reflects that in that percentage.
And James, I give the tobacco companies credit in this sense. They did frame it as an anti-tax measure, and that mood is very strong in the state right now, and they capitalized on it, and it played out for them.
It was unanswered. I mean, there was really virtually no campaign in favor of it that the voters saw.
Well, speaking of taxes, the big test really is still to come in November. The Jerry Brown tax proposal on people making more than $250,000 a year, an extra tax there, and also joint filers who make more than $500,000 a year would pay a higher tax if Brown's proposal goes through. There's also an alternate proposal. So let's begin looking ahead and talking about the tax proposals. What's going to happen in November, Fred?
Well, we have, I think, already a dozen propositions scheduled for the ballot, and it could go up to as many as 20. We're going to have probably 2 competing tax proposals. We're going to have death penalty. We're going to have abortion. We're going to have illegal immigration. We're going to have a lot of the hot button issues on the ballot. The tax measures, it's still going to be a very tough sell. We have economic news that seems to go up and down every day. One day the employment numbers are low and we're in a panic, and 2 days later we have the biggest gain on Wall Street in a year. It's just complete confusion, and I think people are still very unsettled as to their economic future, and it's going to be very tough for people to say, I'm willing to pay more taxes. So at the same time, you're going to have the schools and others really pushing to make sure this happens. So it's going to be very tough. I think Calabasas is going to be supportive of wanting to fix the state budget, make sure schools and other services are funded. But statewide, it's going to be very, very close.
I forgot to mention the other piece is the fact that Brown would raise the sales tax by a quarter cent in addition to the higher income tax on the wealthy. But James, despite the mood, the anti-tax mood, there is compelling need for more money for schools and public safety. And is that going to be the attack on this pro-tax measure? Save our schools?
I'm not as I don't think these tax measures are going to pass, and I think the reason is I do believe the public does not feel the legislature is working toward balancing the budget. If the legislature between now and November seriously tackles some of the issues involving the budget, it might have a better chance of passage. But if everything breaks down and bills are laden with all kinds of extra money going to pet projects, those kinds of things create negative images in the voters' minds as to why they should be paying for what the legislature is not doing. It should be noted that what Fred said is correct as far as the number of propositions. There are no more propositions on primary ballots after these 2 measures that we discussed. From now on, they'll all be on the general election ballot. So you're going to have heavily laden ballots, and it'd be interesting to see how the voters pick through those, or whether they, in some cases, just skip some of them.
A big litmus test, because this will be the election about the economy. Romney, Obama, tax or no tax in California. It should be interesting. This $11 billion water bond failed earlier. Is it coming back to the ballot? More public money required to help the state's infrastructure with water? Is that going to happen?
Well, it's unclear yet. It's one of the measures that could possibly be put on the November ballot, but I don't think it's been decided yet whether it's
I don't think it's decided.
And how about payroll protection, protecting payroll, keeping payroll deduction from salaries to go toward political causes? Will that one be on the November ballot?
I think that one will be on the ballot.
Yeah. So you have, and it's a big issue with unions and you know, both the union and anti-union sides will be out on that. You know, we're again going to be in California in this sort of bizarro world where there's this very close presidential election and we're not going to know anything about it. I was in Colorado a couple weeks ago and they were already an Obama commercial followed by a Romney commercial. This is in May. And we're not going to see any commercials. Okay, because this state has been given up to by the Republicans. Obama is going to win the state. We're not going to have virtually any campaign out here, but in 6 or 10 states around the country, where there's going to be some of the most intense campaigning you've ever seen. I unfortunately think we're looking at a low turnout, maybe one of the lowest ever for a presidential election, because there's going to be no campaign, no U.S. Senate campaign. Feinstein's going to romp through that. There's no real challenger. People are going to be overwhelmed by the ballot propositions. I mean, there's literally going to be 20. It's yes on this, no on this. You're not going to remember which number is which. And who's going to show up for that? The activists, the death penalty activists and the anti-death penalty. But so I still think it's going to be a low turnout, and that doesn't fare well actually for the tax measures. Because I think they need more of the middle moderate voters, and it also doesn't fare well for this general experiment of getting more independent moderate voters to come vote, where you have 2 Democrats in a race or 2 Republicans in some of these districts.
Do you agree, James? Lackluster turnout in November?
Yes. We'll see on some of these. What we don't know is what will happen. It's been a long time since we've had a lot of legislative races that are competitive, whether that will be enough in individual areas to drive up turnout in competitive districts. It actually wasn't enough in the primary. So if you're judging by that, there wasn't much of a difference in the turnout in districts where there was a lot of money spent and there were 2 or 3 competitive candidates. So I tend to agree with Fred. It'll be a low turnout.
And is marijuana coming back in November?
Yes.
Marijuana's coming back. I left that off the list of controversial issues.
There's a lot.
They're all going to be there.
But interestingly, a lot of these have been done before. Marijuana legalization was just on the ballot. The abortion minor notification, I think, was on the ballot 3 times in the last decade. So a lot of these are retreads, and I'm not sure how much excitement they're going to generate among the voters who have already voted on this several times.
All right.
No same-sex marriage, though. That one is not on the ballot this time.
That'll be in the Supreme Court, though. Well, thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate it as always. Look forward to more fireworks in November. A good nonpartisan website, by the way, lavote.net. You can analyze some of the primary results and look ahead. And of course, cityofcalabasas.com. Always good information there about what's happening in the city and all matters political. So again, thanks to James Bozajian and Fred Gaines. I'm John Loesing. We'll see you again next time on CTV. So long.